看一下拜登总统在记者会上怎么说。
My views on Khashoggi have been absolutely, positively clear. And I have never been quiet about talking about human rights. The reason I'm going to Saudi Arabia, though, is much broader, is to promote U.S. interest. Promote U.S. interest in a way that I think we have an opportunity to reassert what I think we've made a mistake of walking away from, our influence in the Middle East. I'm going to be meeting with 9 other heads of state. It's not just it happens to be in Saudi Arabia. And so there are so many issues at stake that I want to make clear that we can continue to lead in the region and not create a vacuum that is filled by China and or Russia against the interest of both Israel and the United States and many other countries.
拜登总统在以色列期间呢，也同时举办4方会谈，与以色列、印度还有阿拉伯联合酋长国领导人们透过视频的方式进行了会议。那么这个会议的名称呢，叫做 I2U2。拜登总统在会议上呢，特别感谢了印度总理莫迪，还有阿联酋的总统本扎伊德阿勒纳哈扬，说呢，他们透过坚强的合作，把中东地区与印太地区的关键伙伴连接起来。拜登总统并且说呢，现在世界上缺乏透明的基础建设项目，那么未来几年将会跟与会的各国一起来认定并且投资这一些基础建设的项目。我们也知道呢，中国的一带一路的这个基础建设项目呢，向来是被美国与盟国认定是缺乏透明度的。那拜登总统中东之前另外一个关注焦点呢，这是在特朗普政府时期退出的伊朗核协议。那么伊朗呢，对于美国提出重返核协议的一些条件，迟迟都还没有回应。对此呢，拜登总统公开表示，美国不会一直等下去。我们看一下拜登总统在记者会上怎么说。
We've laid out for the people, for the leadership of Iran, what we're willing to accept in order to get back in the JCPOA. We're waiting for the response. When that will come, I'm not certain, but we are not going to wait forever. With regard to Iran and convincing the Saudis and others that we mean what we say, is we mean what we say. They have an opportunity to accept this agreement's been laid down. If they don't, we made it absolutely clear. We will not, let me say it again, we will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon.
以色列总理拉皮德也强调说呢，这个以色列立场就是不会接受伊朗拥有核武。不过他认为呢，这个外交途径已经死亡了。他建议拜登总统呢要放弃用外交途径说服伊朗重返核协议的这个想法。那么拜登总统呢在星期五的时候将会见巴勒斯坦领导人阿巴斯，之后呢将会前往沙特阿拉伯进行访问。卡拉，
好的，感谢姚毅的连线报道。以色列总统赫尔佐格星期四向拜登总统颁发以色列总统勋章。赫尔佐格赞扬拜登总统对以色列及其人民的友情，以及为以色列的安全做出的努力。以色列总理拉皮德、美国国务卿布林肯以及以色列前总理内塔尼亚胡参加了仪式。
The Presidential Medal of Honor is hereby awarded to the Honorable President Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the United States of America for his true friendship with the State of Israel, the people of Israel, and the Jewish people. His uncompromising, decades-long commitment to Israel's security, his contributions to deepening, strengthening, and enhancing the strong and unwavering alliance between Israel and the United States of America, and his struggle against anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic hatred around the world.
Great honor. Thank you very, very much.
为期4天的太平洋岛国论坛周四在斐济闭幕。所罗门群岛总理说，该国将不会允许中国建立军事基地。所罗门群岛总理索加瓦雷对记者说，协议中没有军事基地，也不会有其他任何军事设施或机构。中国与所罗门群岛在今年4月签署了一份安全协议，引发多国担忧。美国副总统哈里斯周三应邀在论坛上发表视频讲话。他提议美国国会在未来10年 将渔业援助经费增加2倍，达到每年6000万美元，并任命第1位美国特使出席该论坛。美国今年2月宣布重开驻所罗门群岛大使馆，索加瓦雷对美国重返所罗门群岛表示欢迎。美国海军说，里根号航空母舰打击群正在南中国海执行例行任务，这是该航母编队今年首次进入南中国海。美国印太司令部在星期三发布的新闻稿中说，里根号航母打击群在南中国海期间将举行海上安全演练，其中包括固定翼和旋翼飞机的飞行行动、海上打击操演以及水面与空中部队的协同战术训练。里根号航母舰长海军上校弗雷德·戈德哈默说，美国航母在南中国海的存在，表明美国致力于一个自由和开放的印太地区。美国商务部长雷蒙多星期四到国会山，呼吁议员尽快通过一项大型投资法案，为美国在技术领域与中国竞争提供资源。在一场闭门简报会上，雷蒙多与2党议员就供应链和半导体产业对国家安全产生的影响进行了简报。国会2党目前正在积极讨论如何推动法案，为美国的先进技术研发和半导体制造提供资金。有关详情，下面我们连线美国之音记者李奕华为我们介绍。奕华。
好的，卡拉，美国商务部长雷蒙多星期四呢是到国会山的众议院来向2党议员来进行了一场闭门的非公开简报讨论呢，就像您刚刚所提到的，希望能够向这个国会来讨论他们现在国会当中正在审议的一项这个大型的技术投资法案，对于美国的半导体产业以及制造业以及美国国家安全产生的影响。那么这已经是这个雷蒙多这个星期第2次到国会山来。那么星期三的时候呢，雷蒙多呢也是特地到这个国会的参议院一侧，向2党的议员就同样的主题了进行了一场闭门的这个简报会。那么也看得出来，现在拜登政府呢正在积极大力的推动国会呢能够尽速的通过这项大型的技术投资法案。那么这项名为跨党派创新与竞争法的法案，之所以受到拜登政府这么高度的重视，很大的一部分原因是因为这个法案当中包含了条款，将为美国的半导体产业呢提供这个520亿美元的这个补助。那我们知道，美国现在许多产业呢，因为半导体当中的这个芯片短缺的问题呢，而面临了相当严重的这种困境。因此，拜登政府现在正在积极的大力推动来发展美国的半导体产业。那么，这个雷蒙多呢，在星期三与这个参议员会面完之后呢，接受媒体采访的时候，也是再一次的呼吁国会呢能够尽快的通过法案。来听听雷蒙多部长在星期三这个在参议院怎么说。
The urgency was clear. It felt like by the end there was an agreement based upon the questions people were asking that this is a national security imperative. The United States has to lead in these technologies, particularly chips, and the time for talking is done, the time for action is here. My recommendation is that they move quickly. My recommendation is that it's a matter of national security, that they pass a bill before the August recess, that it is as robust and comprehensive a bill as possible, and specifically that they absolutely have to focus on the chips investments, because if they don't, these chip companies are going to invest, they're going to do it outside of America.
是的，那么跨党派创新与竞争法呢，目前正在国会当中由一个这个107位2党议员所组成的协商委员会来进行审议，目标呢希望能够解决2院这个法案版本的这个分歧。那么这个在这个不过呢，我们也知道这个法案的内容相当的繁琐，这个内容呢是高达了大概3000多页的这个内容，那么涉及到的资金也是相当的庞大，因此呢，要解决法案当中的分歧，其实难度相当的高。因此现在也有国会当中就是国会当中现在也开始有声音讨论说，是不是将这个有关于半导体芯片这个补助的部分单独切割出来通过法案。那么这个因此呢，就可以不会因为这个法案庞大而这个耽误时间，来错过了现在的这个与企业之间的这个合作的黄金时期。那么对此呢，这个参议院情报委员会 会的主席，来自维吉尼亚州的民主党联邦参议员沃纳，从今年3月就一直在大力推动有关于单独推动这个半导体芯片的这个补助的部分。那么他也是大力的推动这个法案的通过。那么他在接受媒体采访的时候呢，也是强调了说，现在美国如果错过了这个黄金时期，将会落后半导体产业好几年的时间。我们继续来听听这个沃纳参议员在接受媒体采访时怎么说。
If we don't act now, a delay of months could turn into a delay for years because even when we have this additional government assistance, it only covers about 10 to 20% of the costs. And once a company makes a major multi-billion, $10 to $20 billion investment somewhere else, they don't have the capital to say, okay, if 6 months later we come with, here's America's willingness to invest. They'll say, sorry, we've already committed our capital. We're building that facility, whether it be in Taiwan or South Korea or China. So that's why I think for a lot of my colleagues, the light went off that we don't have the luxury of waiting. Clearly there's parts of the bill that there's still some contention on, but around chips, 5G, the investment tax credit, there seemed to be an awful lot of agreement in that.
那么在被问到呢，是否支持国会单独通过芯片补助的部分，让企业能够早点收到这个补助资金哦？这个雷蒙多是表示他是支持这样的做法的。那么他还是强调说，他不管他在这个与议员的会谈当中，并没有讨论到这个如何通过法案的技术层面。不过他强调说，只要国会能够通过有关的这个补助和资金，那么拜登政府方面都会大力的支持。我们继续来听听雷蒙多的说法。
We want the most robust bill possible, and so we want them to negotiate and get a bill done by August 4th. What I can say is it seems to be talking to senators and talking to members of the House that they're coalescing around, a CHIPS plus kind of a bill. And if that were to happen, we would be very supportive of that.
不过，即使有了这个行政部门方面的支持单独将法案当中的这个芯片部分单独出来通过呢，这个也是面临了相当高的阻力。即使是在国会的民主党人当中，也不见得是一致的支持这样的做法。那么，例如说，这个来自这个德拉瓦州的民主党联邦参议员库恩斯在接受媒体采访的时候，他就直言表示，他是不赞成这么做的。他认为，如果要通过法案，必须要整部法案都一起通过，不应该由芯片的部分单独通过。我们来继续听听库恩斯说的议员的说法。
No, I would not. The committee on which I served that contributed, the Foreign Relations Committee, the part of the bill that we contributed came out of our committee 21-1. There's not a lot of agreement that's that broad and that strong on something relating to foreign relations. And there's a lot of focus right now on Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe. This was valuable work we did a year ago. We should still move forward with this. I would hate to see that carved out of the bill. That would be a waste of significant bipartisan effort.
那么另外一位在这个也相当关注这个，并且在这个法案当中大力推动的这个议员是来自德克萨斯州的共和党联邦参议员柯宁。那么柯宁在接受媒体采访的时候也是表示他直接表示说，现在两党议员呢，事实上对于如何推动法案还没有任何的共识，是否是单独通过还是要包含在一起通过，是还没有达成任何的共识的。不过他说两党呢正在积极的协商。不过呢，如果呢两党的议员希望能够在8月4号休会之前能够完成这部大型法案的这个立法工作的话，时间上来讲相当的紧迫，只剩下不到20天左右的时间，因此可以想见了，这个7月份整个这个国会的行程将会非常的忙碌。那么有关于任何法案的进展，美国之音也会随时为观众来掌握。以上是记者在国会方面所掌握到的情况，时间交还给主持人卡拉。
好的，感谢易华带来国会方面的消息。目前，斯里兰卡政局持续动荡。美国财政部长耶伦周四敦促中国参与斯里兰卡的债务重组，称这样做符合中国和斯里兰卡双方的利益。耶伦在印尼参加20国集团财长会议期间举行的新闻发布会上说，希望 G20 和其他的G20的其他成员向北京施加压力，在斯里兰卡的债务结构重组方面提供更多的合作。
We're really looking to China to step up their role in debt restructurings that are eligible for treatment under the common framework we've not seen much progress. And part of what I expect to do over the next several days is urge our partners and in the G20 to put pressure on China to be more cooperative in restructuring these unsustainable debts. China is, of course, a very important creditor of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is clearly unable to repay that debt, and it's my hope that China will be willing to work with Sri Lanka to restructure the debt.
美国军方星期三宣布，近期成功进行了2款不同高超音速导弹系统的试验。根据来自美国空军和国防先进研究项目署的消息，美国空射快速反应武器在初期经历了失败之后，星期二在加州海岸外对其助推火箭进行的试射中，取得连续第2次的成功。这是一款助推滑翔系统，利用火箭将导弹加速到高超音速时释放滑翔器，使之以超过5马赫的速度攻击目标。美国军方目前正在研发和测试多款高超音速武器。高超音速武器是美中俄激烈竞争的领域之一。中国的高超音速武器已经装备部队，俄罗斯的高超音速武器已经用于乌克兰战场。欢迎继续收看《美国观察》。中国在拉美地区的影响力扩大，引发美国的忧虑。在不久前于洛杉矶举行的美洲峰会上，美国与拉美国家签署一系列合作倡议，凸显了拜登政府力求加强地区关系的决心。拉美国家如何看待美国在这个问题上的努力？随着中国在拉美地区的经济足迹加深，美国需要采取哪些有力的应对措施？就这些问题，美国之音专访了智利前驻华大使豪尔赫·海涅。他表示，美国的拉美政策或需部分重置，来关注当地面临的艰巨挑战和成长需求。
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for speaking with the Voice of America. Today, I would like to focus on the U.S.-China competition for influence in Latin America. First of all, how would you evaluate the status quo? Some people are saying that the U.S. is losing influence to China in the region. Do you agree?
Over the past 20 years, China's presence in Latin America has increased significantly. Now, it is important to look at this not as some sort of zero-sum game. The view of many governments and of many analysts and policymakers is that it is a good thing that Latin America trades and does business with more countries rather than with fewer ones.
Of course, the diversification and this competition is good for Latin American countries, but what does it mean for the U.S.?
For quite a while, the view in the United States and in Washington was that business that Latin America did with China was, in the end, a positive thing. It meant more Latin American growth. It meant that the Latin American economies would be more stable, and that in the end, the U.S. would also benefit. There would be fewer migration pressures, and there would be fewer issues in the region for the United States to have to contend with.
We were speaking in general, right? But Latin America is not a monolith. Actually, countries have their differences. Some might, lean more towards China, while others might prioritize their relationships with the U.S. How do you see this division? What are the driving forces behind it?
My impression is that, as a rule, most Latin American governments, what they want to do is they want to have good relations, both with the United States and with China. And if there is a healthy competition, say there is a tender for a particular bridge or a dam, and you have both US firms and Chinese firms competing in that tender, I think, everybody benefits. It would not be a good idea for Latin American governments to automatically, mechanically side either with Washington or with Beijing on a range of issues, on a range of questions. What I have argued in a recent book that I've co-authored with some colleagues, which is called Active Non-Alignment in Latin America, a doctrine for the new century. What we argue there is that Latin American countries should look at issues, on its own and look at their own national interest. In some cases, it will mean siding with the United States, on issues of democracy and human rights, for example. It is quite likely that Latin American countries will be closer to the US position than to the Chinese position. On the other hand, on issues of, say, international trade, in which the United States has been increasingly protectionist, it is likely that Latin American countries will side with China. The point we're trying to make is that this will vary from issue to issue, and active non-alignment stands for making pragmatic decisions based on the national interest of each of the Latin American countries.
Washington actually has been doing a lot of soul searching recently about whether the U.S. has overlooked Latin America in the past decades. And President Biden early on vowed to change that and to build up the relationship with the region. That's why we've seen at the Summit of Americas a series of economic, health, and migration initiatives were rolled out. I'm wondering how these initiatives and Biden's efforts in general have been received by local people in Latin America.
I think it is important for Latin American leaders to get together with the US president and discuss issues of common concern. Now, that said, there were a number of important issues brought to the fore in the summit, including the migration issue, which has become particularly complex. On the economic front, most people would say that the agenda was not particularly ambitious. I've used the term pretty thin. Latin America is going through a severe economic crisis. It has been hit both by the pandemic and by an economic slowdown. So urgent measures are needed. About a third of Latin Americans live under the poverty line right now. And on that, there wasn't much in Los Angeles. And to give you another example, in question of market access, many countries in Latin America, including my own Chile, have free trade agreements with the United States, but there are some that do not. Uruguay and Ecuador would like to have a free trade agreement with the United States, but they have been told it's a non-starter. So, that's the other side of the coin.
You also mentioned that whether the U.S. could provide a better alternative to China's plan. Since 2017, 21 Latin American countries have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, and more are expected to join. But last year, the U.S. and other G7 countries launched a global infrastructure initiative called the Build Back Better World. Don't you think it's a better alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative?
I think this is a positive development. Now, when one looks at the numbers, it is unclear how many fresh resources are being put on the table by the United States for this Build Back Better program. It is one thing to encourage private companies to do things. It is another to come up with actual resources that are put on the table. BRI does that. It is unclear whether Build Back Better will do that.
But because of the economic and political structure that the U.S. has, the U.S. government's hands are always tied, right? The funding power of the U.S. government is very much limited. That's why the U.S. policy, has to be heavily dependent on the private sector, while the Chinese government is able to direct their economic activities. And China's investment in Latin America is made largely by state-owned firms whose pockets are, as deep as national treasury. So do you think the U.S. is competing with China in a fair game?
Well, life is not necessarily fair. The Chinese system is what it is, and the U.S. system is what it is. I could think of, say, tax incentives or other measures that the United States could take to promote more investment in Latin America. As it is, for example, in the construction field, very few U.S. companies, there are some very significant U.S. construction companies, but basically they don't participate in tenders and bids in Latin America. They consider them too small. They say there's too much corruption. Well, Chinese companies do participate.
I think it reviews major differences between the U.S. and China approaches. The U.S. stresses that the importance of democratic institutions and the rule of law, but China argues that economic prosperity does not need to be entangled with democratic values. So how do you see the difference? Which approach is actually working?
Yes, well, I will say this. For Latin America, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, this big crisis, 1 out of every 3 Latin Americans under the poverty line, the significant development challenges that the region faces. It is development that is the main concern of Latin American countries. And many interpret this emphasis on, say, democracy as a way of weaponizing democracy in the competition that the United States has with China. Latin American countries and Latin American governments are not interested in participating in geopolitical competition. What they're interested in is in furthering their development, in increasing the standard of living of their populations, and getting out of the difficult situation they find themselves. And that is the approach that is being followed.
But are you concerned that China's approach might bring short-term gains but long-term risks to Latin American countries?
Well, perhaps, as John Maynard Keynes used to say, in the long term, we'll all be dead. But governments in Latin America today have to deal with some serious issues of unemployment, of the need for poverty alleviation, for investment, for trade. And they are willing to engage those countries that will respond to those needs. So those are the priorities.
So what would be your suggestions for Biden administration to improve the U.S. relationship with Latin America nowadays?
So I think that's a great question. And I would hope that after what happened in Los Angeles, after the Summit of the Americas that was recently held, that there would be some sort of reset for U.S. policy towards Latin America. And that people in Washington should realize that the main concern in Latin America right now is the development challenge and the need for economic growth. And to reach that, Latin American countries want to have more trade with the United States. They would like to have more investment from the United States. They would like to see a greater presence of U.S. companies in Latin America. So if the Biden administration can do something about that, it seems to me would be the best way forward.
好了，以上就是今天美国观察的全部内容，感谢您的收看，祝您周末愉快。
观众朋友。